Greetings, everyone. I'm so sorry about those technical issues. As I think you've heard, there was some changes with Blackboard, and all of the Mac users are having problems. What I was able to do last week, I'm no longer able to do, so who knows? So I'm calling in from the phone, so hopefully you can hear me okay. So welcome to the Student Experience, Pacing and Personalization. It's a Baking Mastery Work webinar, and we'll hear a little bit more about that in 1 second. I'm a little bit discombobulated from all these tech issues. Let me focus. So I want to welcome you because we have 3 incredible speakers today. We have Ephraim Whitestein from Schools for the Future and also one of the co-designers of Diploma Plus. We have Andrew Skarzinski from the, I know by the initials, Medical Profession and Teacher Training Academy, which I think I have wrong, which we will correct in a second. And then we have David Osborne from the National Center for Education and the Economy. Before I start, I want to give you a little background for those of you who are new to CompetencyWorks. I recognize most of the names, but not all, so let me just give this background. CompetencyWorks is a project of the International Association for K-12 Online Learning. iNicole is a nonprofit organization with over 4,000 members focused on student-centered new learning models using online and blended learning that are competency-based. iNicole's #1 policy priority is moving away from seat time to competency education, supporting policies and practices that provide more effective learning for students. iNicole is pleased to partner on the CompetencyWorks project with so many terrific organizations. We couldn't do this work without our partners, the American Youth Policy Forum, National Government Association, and Jobs for the Future, and our terrific advisory board. You can find our advisory board at competencyworks.org. We'd also like to take this opportunity to recognize the leadership and generosity of our funders. We have a special thanks to Nellie May Education Foundation. They've been an outstanding partner, and none of this would be possible without them. So a little bit about CompetencyWorks.org. We're dedicated to creating a virtual learning space for those of you advancing competency education across the country. As you probably know, you can find blog posts written by students, teachers, principals, consultants, and state leaders sharing what they're learning. We periodically write briefing papers on topics that are of high interest. We'll be releasing one on state policy and one on information management systems in the next month. And we offer the Competency-Based Pathways Wiki so that you can find additional resources when you need them. So this is where you find the wiki on this little blue button, and it'll take you to tons of information. This webinar will be archived, and resources can be found at the Competency-Based Pathways Wiki. You may want to create a tab so that you can take a look during the webinar. And let's see. Oh, yes. During this webinar, we highly encourage you to use the chat room. We really see this as an opportunity for peer-to-peer networking, and we found that this is a vital part of our conversation. Please introduce yourself now if you haven't yet, and let us know where you're from and what's your interest in competency education. Feel free to ask questions, comments, refer people to resources, and talk about how your work is developing. We have an incredibly knowledgeable group of innovators participating in the webinar, and we really hope that if you approach things differently than it's being described in the presentation, that you will share your insights in the chat room. Now, please ask your questions in the chat room. We have 2 points in the presentation where we will pause and respond to questions, and Rob Darrow from iNicole and myself will draw out those questions and then ask the panelists the questions. Okay, let's see. So, what we're going to do for here's the overview. I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to competency education, and then we're going to hear 2 very, very different approaches to pacing and personalization. And this is just an incredible opportunity to really think about the design choices to make sure that all students are being able to stay on pace and on track towards college and career readiness. And at the very end, we will do upcoming events and resources. So, competency education, a working definition. So hopefully everybody has seen this. States and schools are using different language to talk about competency education, such as proficiency-based or mastery-based. It's fine to use whatever language you want. What's important is that we are really working towards a shared definition and understanding. In front of you is the definition that CompetencyWorks uses based on input from innovators in the field, regardless of what we call it, what we we have to keep our commitment to helping students reach proficiency with adequate time and supports. We really keep a very strong focus on quality in all of our webinars and all of our work that we do in CompetencyWorks. In the current system, we're allowing some students to progress without the skills they need, and others are being held back. This definition is driving towards this concept of quality. Each of the elements is important, and if you have any questions about the definition, you can find there's a more detailed one on the wiki. So now let me introduce our panelists. As I said, we have Ephraim Weinstein, founder of Schools for the Future. We have David Osborne, engagement manager for the National Center for Education and the Economy, and Andrew Skarzinski, who I apologize, I almost got the name of the school right. It is Medical Professions and Teacher Preparation Academy. I've not had the opportunity to visit, but I have been hearing great things about the school, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I'm now going to turn it over to Ephraim Weinstein, who actually, let me take a minute to say this. Ephraim is the person who introduced me to competency education about 20 years ago. It was the first time I'd ever heard of it, and I've learned pretty much everything I know I've learned from Ephraim. And he also is one of the co-authors of Making Mastery Work. So he's going to give us a little background about Making Mastery Work, as well as talk to us about the designs in schools for the future. So Ephraim, I'm going to put my phone on mute and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Now, Chris, one question, so you need to unmute for a second. My understanding was that I was going to do the first part of what you were saying, but to hold Schools for the Future discussion until after NCEE and MPTPA went. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you do
okay.
this gives
okay.
the project.
Thanks. Okay, welcome everyone, and just going to talk briefly about Making Mastery Work, which was a project or an initiative overseen by the Nellie Mae Education Foundation with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so I want to acknowledge both of those. And the initiative was launched in March 2011. There was a pre-process by which we asked for any school, any educator providers in New England to propose to the Nellie Mae Education Foundation that they participate in the project, which is meant to be, or was meant to be, a learning project. In other words, it was not about to fund implementation, but rather to learn about what it is that makes competency approaches successful. So from the call for proposals, I believe there was something in the vicinity of 40 proposals. We narrowed that down to 7 projects which we chose. And the 7 projects, which encompass 11 schools, are really a mix from all of the New England states with the exception of New Hampshire for some reason. Urban, rural, suburban. All of the schools are public, small high schools with fewer than 600 students. And the one piece bringing everyone together, again, was a commitment to be testing out what it meant to be approaching the work from a competency-driven approach, which really means, just for the sake of clarity, really 2 main definers. One is that it's all about focusing on mastery. So there's a set of mastery goals / standards that every school has identified for every student at different levels. And then the issue of time and pacing, with the idea that time is a variable. So it might take Ephraim 5 years to graduate, but he graduates college ready, and it might take Chris only 3 years to graduate college ready, because that's what she needs. So the time is variable, but the goal of proficiency and graduating college ready is the same for everyone. So the participants in the initiative were, first of all, Big Picture Company, which is an intermediary with 2 schools, Boston Day and Evening Academy in Boston, Massachusetts, as you might expect, Casco Bay High School in Portland, Maine. Diploma Plus, my former place, was the second intermediary that was basically sponsoring 3 schools, the Champion High School in Brockton, Charleston High School in Massachusetts, Boston, and E-Cubed in Providence. Gray New Gloucester High School, which was actually the middle school and the high school. which is in Maine, MPTPA, which you're going to hear more about today, and Virgins Union High School, which is in Vermont. So in terms of the highlights of, and if you haven't gotten the executive summary of this, you might want to ask Nellie Mae to send it to you, or you can also download it at their website. But the main conclusions, and I'm going to kind of go through this quickly, the main conclusions of the paper are, A, what I already said, the two key distinguishers are measurable definition of mastery, and second, the flexible use of time. One of the major factors or major findings that we did find was that for many students, competency-based education is more motivating and more engaging, particularly around this idea of students finding their own pace. We also found, surprise, surprise, that one of the main difficulties in doing this is the fact that the traditional world still thinks in terms of traditional schedules, credits, transcripts, etc., so that makes translation an issue. Fourth, that there is no single blueprint for how to do this, which is either the good news or the bad news, depending on how you look at this, because at this point, the field of competency-based education is still relatively nascent, and it's largely let 1,000 flowers bloom, and each of the 7 approaches that were studied in this paper each have significant differences from each other, although there are also, as you would expect and hope, a lot of commonality. The other huge issue in terms of the challenge is around the type of technology tools that we have in terms of everything from tracking student progress to other applications of technology. And we heard over and over again from schools that were participating in this, the frustration with purchasing a particular tool, whether it was a student information system or a learning management system, and not having it meet all of the needs that they had thought that it would. So that is a major block. And lastly, that we do think, which is the good news, is that competency-based education, we believe, is likely to expand over the next couple of years because of a number of favorable policy and other external conditions that we may talk about later on. So I'm going to stop yapping with that and turn it back over to Chris.
Hi, everyone. So now let's hear from David Osborne and Andrew Skarzinski. And David and Andrew, I think if you need us to, just tell us when to forward the slides.
All right, very good. This is David Osborne. Thanks, everybody, for participating in this webinar. It's exciting to be here and talk with you. As Ephraim was mentioning, there are lots of different flavors of competency-based education that are popping up all around. And I'm going to describe one particular brand of this, a program that we've been working on at the National Center for Education and the Economy. The program is called Excellence for All, and you'll hear from Andrew Skarzinski, who's the principal of one of our Excellence for All schools, in a minute. But I wanted to give you a quick overview of the Excellence for All program so you have some sense of kind of the overall umbrella under which schools like Andrew's are operating. By way of background, NCEE for nearly a quarter century has been benchmarking high-performing education systems around the world. So when you hear studies about places like Finland or Singapore or England doing a better job of educating their students, NCEE has been doing a lot of that international benchmarking research. And the Excellence for All program is an outgrowth of kind of the lessons that we've been able to learn from some of these high-performing educational systems around the world. Next slide, please. And so we basically, what we see is in these kind of high-performing systems, they have instructional systems that are slightly different from what we find here in the United States. They are much more aligned than the systems that we have in this country, meaning that they start with very, very high standards to begin with. They have very rigorous curricula that's aligned with the high standards. They have very thoughtfully constructed assessments that are aligned with the curricula and with the high standards. They have great teacher training and professional development that's aligned with all of these things. So if you're in a country like Finland, the idea of teaching to the test doesn't sound like a foreign or a bad thing, because the assessments are in fact derived directly from the curriculum and the standards, and the teachers are trained to figure out the best ways to get as many students to that high standard as possible, not just the high performing kids, but the kids who are in the middle and the kids who are struggling and behind. And we wanted to see whether we could bring similar instructional systems to US high schools and see how that would work. Next slide, please. And so the Excellence for All program, in essence, is an outgrowth of all of that work. We started a year and a half ago in 21 high schools in 4 states, Arizona, Connecticut, Kentucky, and Mississippi. And we have 39 high schools currently operating this school year, including Andrews in Connecticut. We're in the process of recruiting more schools, and so the program seems to be growing at a fairly good clip. It's going to be evaluated by the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research, so we get an understanding of what worked and what didn't work. Next slide, please. One of the big things that NCEE has brought to this program is the work of a technical advisory committee that has certified some leading instructional system providers, including the University of Cambridge International Exams, ACT Quality Corps, College Board AP, and the International Baccalaureate program. They have set qualification scores in a number of the major subject areas that the students have to take. Ephraim had talked about 2 different elements being common for all of these competency-based educational systems. One of them is a measurable definition of mastery. For the Excellence for All program, we divide high school into 2 different sections, a lower division and an upper division. And for a student to demonstrate mastery and move out of the lower division portion of high school, the student has to meet qualification scores in his or her exams in 5 different subject areas. And so that level of mastery is tied to a community college level readiness standard. So we have a very particular standard that we're trying to get all high school students to, and then when students are able to get to that standard, then they have an array of options that are going to be available to them. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we divide high school into 2 different portions, a lower division portion and an upper division portion. In the lower division, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slides, they're required to take 2 English courses, 2 mathematics courses. They have to complete exams and pass their exams in Algebra 1 and Geometry. They'll have 2 lab-based sciences, typically biology and chemistry. They'll have 2 years of history, U.S. history and a world history course, and 1 year of the arts. And we're fairly flexible on the arts, but our feeling is that we want to have well-rounded students coming out and not students who are just focusing on the kind of maths and Englishes, as we've sort of been focusing on in large degree over the last decade or so, in part due to some of the federal requirements that have been coming down. If students pass all of their lower division end of course exams in these 9 areas, then they have an array of options from which to choose. They can either remain in high school and take an upper division academic program that prepares them for very rigorous and competitive 4-year colleges and universities. They can focus on a career and technical education path if such a path exists for them in their high school or in their region. They can do a dual credit program if such a program exists in their high school and with a local area college. Or if they prefer, they could actually leave high school early with a proficiency-based high school diploma and matriculate directly into community college without the need for remediation. Next slide, please. Oop, I pretty much went through this, so we might as well go to the next slide, please. So in the lower division, again, what we're trying to do is move away from kind of the typical model of high school where standards may be variable, but time is the constant. Students are going to be in high school for 4 years, no matter whether they are an A student or whether they're scraping by the skin of their teeth. What we are trying to do is to implement a performance-based high school model instead, where if a student can demonstrate their readiness, they have the opportunity, if they want, to leave high school as early as the end of their sophomore year. Or it may take them to the end of their junior year to pass all of their exams, or it may take them to the end of their senior year. But in the end, what we're trying to do is hold very high standards constant, but time now becomes the variable. What we're also trying to do is make sure that we're reaching the students who might otherwise have considered dropping out because, quite frankly, they were bored with school, and that was starting to cause other sorts of issues. Teenagers tend to be very, very savvy, and if you offer a teen here are the 9 things that you have to do, but if you do these things, then you have the possibility of leaving high school early. You may get a more dedicated student than you might otherwise have had. Next slide, please. For the upper division, again, this portion of the program is really focused on kids who are going to be entering into a competitive 4-year college or university. They'll be taking courses like the equivalent of a suite of AP courses, or pursuing a diploma program through Cambridge or through the International Baccalaureate program. So again, it's really designed to get kids ready for very competitive 4 years colleges or universities. Next slide, please. And so, now what does all of this have to do with pacing and personalization? All of the schools in the Excellence for All program really have to do a good job of looking at the data regarding the students who are entering into high school. What do we know about them? What do their scores and performance indicate? Where do they need help, and where are they going to need support? And so we strongly encourage all of our participating Excellence for All schools to really dig deep into the data, find out what's going on with each of these students, and figure out whether they're ready for the rigor of the program or whether they need certain other supports before they may be ready. So for example, if a student is known to be 2 or 3 years behind in mathematics, or a couple years behind in their reading levels, they may not be ready for the freshman year course load and may require, for example, a year to catch up. Pacing is a huge issue, whether it means pacing to help a student complete a certain course over the course of 1 year, or maybe that course may need to be stretched out over a year and a half. There's different ways of looking at how long it may take a student to master a particular subject area. We also do a lot in terms of the data that we get back from the end of course examinations, each of which provide sub-scores in each of the subject areas, so the teachers have a good sense of where the students went wrong on their end of course examinations and can design very personalized programs of study to help the student prepare to retake the exams and hopefully pass them the next time that they take them. And so, next slide, please. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Andrew Skarzinski, who is the principal at one of our Excellence for All schools, Medical and Teachers Preparatory Academy. So Andrew, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thank you, David. Can everyone hear me at this point? David, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so we as a school began in August of 2010, and one of the important things to realize is that we are still considered a brand new school. We began with grades 6 through 9 and 2 preschool classrooms that supported our education preparation theme. And we've grown to 333 students this year in grades 6 through 11. And one of the purposes behind our school came out of landmark court decision, Sheff versus O'Neill, which charged that the state of Connecticut was responsible for the racial and socioeconomic isolation of the city of Hartford. So over 50% of our students come to us on free and reduced lunch programs, 22% of our students are non-minority, and we have 77% of our students are female. So we have some interesting demographics. Next slide, please. Really, our model that we've worked with, and David has spoken much of this, is we are implementing the Cambridge International General Certificate of Secondary Ed curriculum for all students in grades 9 through 10, and this is in conjunction with the NCEE's Excellence for All. One of the pieces when we were approached with this opportunity, our primary goal was really to empower students with the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and competencies to be successful in really a highly competitive international marketplace, as well as to enter college without the need for remediation. And our secondary goal is really to provide students with the academic skills to pursue their own learning beyond the prescribed curriculum, especially regarding our two themes of the medical professions and teacher preparation in the fields of healthcare, both healthcare and education. Having that mindset of being a continuous lifelong learner was really critical. And for us, being able to look at programming decisions that would really impact students and really facilitate that mindset was critical for us. Next slide, please. So when we were approached to implement Cambridge and proficiency-based pathways, we really looked at some critical decisions behind this. And one was really a fundamental belief in the mission of our school and our district that all students can learn at high levels. We are in an expanding district. We started with, we were 8 schools as little as 4 years ago, and now we're up to 18, and much of this came out of this desegregation and reducing racial and socioeconomic isolation. It was also to provide it was an opportunity to really develop a unique learning environment, and seldom is there an opportunity to really create a school and develop the learning environment that we would like, and this really fit with and as well as establishing the sense of urgency and purpose for our high school students. Several of our teachers, and including myself, had served on freshman failure committees. We had looked at what typically happened with high school students when there wasn't that sense of urgency, and really that sense of purpose of what students need to do. And the opportunity to create this sense of urgency we found was critical in helping develop our students and raising their level of expectations for themselves. We have a young staff, relatively, the majority of our teachers have fewer than 5 years of experience, and Cambridge itself provides extensive professional development really to enhance their understanding of teaching and instruction, as well as looking for exemplars of student work and great examples of what we expect students to be able to know and do, and as well as the clarity of learning outcomes for all students. Next slide, please. So our model in this whole mindset of work hard, get smart, we started with 9th grade in the previous school year in subjects of English, world history, math, and science. And we've transitioned on to 9th and 10th grade, and we are including all subjects in English, history, math, science, and art. And within all these courses, students all participate in end-of-course examinations that are externally scored, as well as work samples and work demonstrations within the classroom. So it's not a singular time period and time stamp for students, but it is a flexible piece where students are able to submit coursework in which they're also able to demonstrate their understanding. And David mentioned their technical advisory board's been working on benchmark or qualification scores, and they lead to a performance-based high school diploma. Next slide. In terms of pacing and personalization, and this is, as David's mentioned and Ephraim has mentioned, this has been a challenging area. But students do have the opportunity to participate in these end-of-course examinations until he or she receives a qualification score. And really the clarity of the content allows for adjusting this learning time. And this was a learning piece for our teachers in really examining how to really pull apart these pieces of a fairly, I would say an incredibly rigorous curriculum and very key outcomes for students, and to be able to pull those pieces back to adjust the learning time. And it's a piece where we are still continuing to grow. But there was also a narrower scope of content, and we've seen many, many courses and traditional courses may have survey history courses or very survey and broad-oriented science and English courses. the emphasis within the Cambridge coursework is really is depth, and looking at smaller time periods in history, for instance, and allowing students those opportunities to explain their thinking and demonstrate their thinking in a multitude of ways. As far as supporting and enriching students, where we look at both the struggling learner and the faster paced learner, there are plenty of opportunities to do that within the coursework where there is a significant amount of extended enrichment, what we'd call the extended core work. But one of the pieces that we also found for support was really this level of assessment literacy. And we can talk more about this in a little bit, but we found that it was critical for students to be able to learn what the tests were, what the qualification exams were asking, and what the work was asking, so that they could more adequately substantiate and demonstrate their understanding. Next slide, please. And so what are some of our big learnings with all this? First and foremost, our students are all highly capable of learning at high levels, and we found that this has really established a strong bedrock of high expectations for students within our program. We also, as David's mentioned, determining student learning levels prior to the start of the year is essential for planning each student's trajectory, and that was a critical component. Teaching students how to learn has been as critical as developing the process, has been critical in developing a process for that learning, and learning about learning has been critical as formative assessment. And one of the, we can continue to talk more about this, but one of the biggest other pieces we've discovered is really the level of student ownership in learning. It's been just incredibly critical for establishing this level of collective expectations among the student body. So that's been our plan. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Ephraim, who can talk about his program as well.
Thanks.
Yeah, we're going to do questions. 1 minute, Ephraim, you'll be on. Okay, so David and Andrew, we've had a couple different questions. One clarifying one. Andrew, at your school, could students graduate by age 16? Or
Under state of Connecticut law, yes, students could apply for what's called the board examination certificate and be able to move on after demonstrating that they've met the qualification scores necessary to graduate. And that would be a successful qualification score within Cambridge examinations.
Ephraim, mute your phone again. Sorry, everybody. Charters and districts. So, David, could you give us a sense of when you look at all the schools in your network, how many of those are charters and how many of them are district-run schools?
The vast majority of them are public district-run schools. I think we have maybe 5 or so schools out of the 39 that are charters, but the vast majority of them are your traditional public high schools.
I can clarify. We are a fully public magnet school with a blind lottery. We don't have any sort. The only sort of benchmark assessments that we use for students are for really determining what interventions and enrichments need to be put in place for kids. But we don't have any sort of entrance exams like magnet schools and other places may. We're purely a blind lottery.
Great, thank you. And one other one. And let's start with Andrew on this. Have you found that there's any federal policies or mandates that get in your way or make it harder for you to do your work as compared to state policies?
We still exist within a credit-bearing world, and that's a piece that we continue to work with and try to work around. The Connecticut state law is fairly strict in terms of what their graduation requirements are. We're fortunate to be in a transitional period between what the old policies were and between the implementation for new high school reform across the state of Connecticut. But I will say that continuing to work around those graduation requirements is still a bit of a challenge.
Great. And then David, if you could give us any sense of, from your perspective, working in different states, whether or not federal policies or mandates are inhibiting the model.
It definitely has gotten tricky with the interplay between the state accountability systems and the federal reporting requirements. And there's a little bit of a parallel track that's been going on in some of the states where, because they're not quite sure how this all works, students have been required to take both the end-of-course assessments that are required by our program. So, for example, in Andrew's case, he's using Cambridge as his provider, and so the students take the end-of-course examinations in each of the Cambridge subjects. But then students are also having to take the state accountability tests. In Kentucky, it worked out really, really well because Kentucky wound up going to ACT Quality Core as the basis for their state accountability testing. And so all of the Excellence for All schools in Kentucky are using ACT Quality Core end-of-course examinations. And so that works out really, really well. In Mississippi, where we have a couple of Cambridge schools similar to Andrew's, kids have had to take the Mississippi SATP2 test as part of their state accountability system, but then also take the Cambridge end-of-course examinations. We're kind of working with the state of Mississippi right now on a kind of mapping that would allow students to just take the Cambridge end-of-course examinations in lieu of the state accountability tests. But that's been a little bit of a tricky process, and it's also tricky in the state of Arizona, which also has its own state accountability tests. And so there is a bit of an interplay in terms of the reporting requirements. And what we don't want is to have our schools be disadvantaged because their students, in essence, are really taking much harder end-of-course examinations. If you've seen a Cambridge end-of-course exam, and Andrew can speak to this, the students are really, really stretched. There are no multiple choice sections, with the exception of there's a small multiple choice piece in the biology end-of-course examination. But when they're taking the history test, for example, they are analyzing questions having to do with history and historical eras, and it's all essay writing, and it's all, using really good analytical approaches and problem-solving approaches to solve, historical questions and kind of describe a narrative arc of history. That's unlike anything that you're going to find in any multiple choice tests that, we traditionally use in the United States. And we don't want schools to be disadvantaged and have lower accountability scores because their kids are taking harder exams. And so that's been a bit of a challenge that we've been working on in each of our states.
Thank you, David. That's very helpful. Okay, Ephraim, we are ready to hear from you now about Schools for the Future. And I've had a chance to see the Schools for the Future in its, I think, third week in Detroit, and it's very exciting. So I'm going to mute Ephraim and then just open on the slide forward.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So yeah, Schools for the Future, first of all, let me just say that we are still very much in the pilot stage. We opened up one school, which was a partnership school in Jacksonville, Florida, in August of 2011. I think I have that right. And we just opened up our first charter in Detroit this past September 2012. So we have, at this point, opened up just two schools. The school in Jacksonville, just in terms of transparency, is a partnership with the public schools, and by agreement of both parties, is only implementing certain aspects of the school. So I'm going to really be referring to the Detroit model in terms of where you could actually see the things that I'm referring to. In terms of the first slide here, I only want to highlight on the bottom the support that we've received and just kind of tell you a little bit about what each funder has provided. So Mott Foundation gave us a grant to do the R&D work, to basically have the privilege of bringing together a team to think about this nearly 5 years ago before we even launched the school. The Walton Family Foundation is providing some funding in Detroit for operations. The Noyce Foundation gave us some money for curriculum development. Carnegie Corporation of New York City gave us some early implementation and R&D dollars. Michigan Future Schools, which is a collaborative of the Skilton Foundation and other funders in the Detroit area dedicated to improving education in Detroit public schools, gave us a lot of money for startup activities in the Detroit school over 4 years. And finally, Next Generation Learning, we competed quite hard and were given a grant by Next Generation Learning for our startup in Detroit to demonstrate blended technology. So thank you to all of those funders. And now let's get to the good stuff. So I only have 3 slides. I'm going to just speak for about 8 or 9 minutes on this and then open it up for questions. So first of all, let me try to draw a picture in terms of who we're serving and what our strategy is. So unlike Diploma Plus, my previous model, this is a model for students who have never been in high school. In other words, we're reaching down to middle school grades, in some cases even 6th, but typically 7th and 8th for students who are far off track and by age and skill level should be in high school but are not. And we are then labeling all the students who are coming in to our school essentially as 8th graders, in some cases 9th graders as well. So these are middle school students who are now leaving middle school and coming to us for a multi-year strategy within high school. So the second, in terms of who the student might be, imagine a 16-year-old who is reading and doing math at a 3rd or 4th grade level, should be in high school but is still in the 7th grade. That's our typical student. So then our actual strategy is we have gotten rid of the typical high school and middle school grades and instead replaced it with 4 performance levels, which I'll refer to later on and explain what those are. And lastly, and these are each geared or benchmarked to particular performances for students to be able to leave one level and move into the next. And finally, blended technology is a huge part. We don't define our school as being a quote-unquote technology school, but I don't think we could do what we're doing without it. 24/7 learning is about, as the title said, learning both within and beyond the walls so that students log into our learning management system. We're using Canvas to be able to do additional math or reading or any of their subjects from home. There are some issues with that I'll describe later on, but most of our students can do that. And finally, around the culture, what we're really struggling to get students to understand is that this is their school and their education and their pace. So students can, for example, take as little as 3 years to graduate regardless of where they start, or even less, theoretically. But we're also allowing as many as 5 years, and we are constantly telling students that it's up to you. So when a student or parent would come in, for example, and says, well, how long is it going to take me? When am I going to graduate? We would show them the benchmarks to be able to move from each level and say, it's really up to you. It's how hard you work and how much help you ask for. So going to the next slide, which is key features. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, obviously, it's to assess where our students are at when they come in. So we brought in 108 students at the beginning of school by count day. Once things had kind of been ferreted out, we had 102 solid students with us. That's the official count of students that are on our rolls. But we assessed all of the students using a battery of reading and math assessments at the outset. And what we found, which was not a big surprise to us, was that all of our students, with the exception of 2, so 100 students tested at the core 1 level, which is basically grade 1 to grade 6 on math and literacy. 2 were at core 2, which is 7 to 9. No students were above that, which was not a surprise. So first we got the sense of where are our students, and based on our curriculum and based on our scheduling, we then put together the schedule by week 4. The first 3 weeks were really orientation of students and further assessment to really get a sense of, are we putting students in the right classes and the right activities. So the next, 4 performance levels. Core 1, which I described, Core 2, which I described, the little transitions, which is for students who are doing solid high school level work. So this would be for students at basically grades 10 through 11. And students at this level, and it's very exciting for us, would be actually moving out of the school for as much as 25 to more percentage of the day and the week to be taking dual enrollment college courses, internships, community service learning projects, etc. And that's one of the carrots that we have for students, is to be able to show them and explain that as you become more proficient, become more of an independent learner, what we do is we place you more in independent situations. The very last level, the pathways, is really meant to be a 12th and 13th year. These are students who can just about or can do college level work. They'll be taking quite a few community college courses. They're out of our school for as much as 2/3 of the day, but we do provide some glue activities during the week when they can come back. So performance levels are key, as I said, and I can share this with you later if you would like. We have each of the levels described in terms of what does it take to move through and out of these. Effective strategies. We have a daily packed period, 70 minutes, just like any academic period, which is focusing on 4 key elements. And whatever number it is I say, I always forget one of them, but I'll give it my best. Social emotional literacy. Groups where students of no more than 10 come together and talk about issues that they have identified, everything from, is it hard for me to get out of bed, to issues with substance abuse. Individual problem solving. What are some of the tools and techniques that students can use individually or in groups to get stuff done? Self-efficacy is really powerful, and just to give acknowledgement to the Efficacy Institute, who developed a lot of this, it's about students understanding brain theory and basically the fact that you can get smart by actually exercising your brain rather than some type of bogus theory that you're born with what you have and you can never get better than who you were in some type of IQ test. And lastly, college and career exposure, where students are constantly being exposed to a variety of options out there so they can start getting jazzed about where all this might be leading. So that's the packed period every day for 70 minutes. Youth development staff, we have 3 youth development specialists. They teach the packed periods or facilitate them. They also have caseloads. They work with students around every issue you can imagine, from behavior issues, et cetera, supporting families as well. We have a 4th person on board who has been outstationed here at our school by our partner, Black Family Development, Inc., which is a family social worker providing family and individual service as well. So if you add that person on, we have 4 folks in the affective domain. Teaching and learning, we have a hybrid of stuff that we've bought, like Agile Mind for math and Think Through Math, and for literacy, Achieve 3000, but we also have developed ourselves a lot of the curriculum, with the basic theory being that there's not enough great stuff out there to buy. If there was, we would have bought it because it would have saved us a lot of money. So we're mixing and matching what we bought with what we buy. And a shout out to Redesign out of Boston, Mass, who is our partner and who developed this curricula. And lastly, our approach is one of student investigations. So for all of you who are familiar with the workshop model, which is, I think, a great model, and actually hats off to NCEE, that I believe were one of the original developers of that. The workshop model is very powerful. We're really focused mainly on students doing stuff, investigating. So last slide, and then I'm going to stop talking to give us enough time. Early findings. First of all, surprise, surprise, it is very difficult to change from a traditional way of doing things to a new way of doing things. So everything from our blended technology for staff, for how they're going to use it, to students really buying in and developing this code of I own it and I believe in myself and this is my school, well, it's easier said than done. And it's a constant work in progress. Therefore, reinforce, reinforce, reinforce. We might have done it 5 times, but it's got to be done another 100 times. Make PD consistent. We did 4 weeks of professional development during the summertime. We have common planning time for 70 minutes each day. We have 2 coaches who are here, ELA and math. But I would say even with that, we don't have enough time in the day and week to constantly be reinforcing the way that we want staff to do business. So I would say one of the challenges is do a few things great in terms of professional development. And the last, which I don't think is a surprise for anyone on this line, is that school culture is key. And it's a work in progress. It takes time. All of this is really about, in terms of personalization and pacing, both of those are key to Schools for the Future because we're all about students move forward as quickly as they can, but not faster than they're ready to move out of one set of competencies or standards and into the next. And also that what turns one student on is different than what turns another student on, so we need to find the sweet spot for all students. So those are my 3, and I think we are now up to questions and comments. I, by the way, left out a lot of detail, but maybe some of those will come out in the questions, so thank you.
Thanks, Ephraim. Okay, so there was one clarifying question about Michigan state policy that hopefully you can you'll know the answer to. At what point do students age out of full-time equivalency funding in Michigan, or in other words, how long can they stay in high school?
By age 22.
Great. They have it in latent policy. Wonderful.
And that's why, just in terms of this question, we don't take, well, we basically take students 14 to 18, but we are assuming that the most that any student will have is 5 years with us. So you can do the math in terms of if a student is 16, we think we can do it. If a student is 18, we might have a problem.
Okay, thank you. Anybody, if there's other questions, we didn't get as any other specific questions about your model. I'm looking. But Ephraim, perhaps you could take this time, when you think about personalization, how do you, or what exact elements beyond kids being able to take the time they need, what are the other elements of personalization that you have in your model?
Well, I would say on the academic side, and then I'll talk about the affective side. On the academic side, it's, not only here are the standards and you take the time you need to be able to meet those standards, whether it be a week or a month or longer. So in addition to the kind of time on task, there also is the how. What are you actually going to be engaging in? So our curriculum is meant to offer students options, and they're making choices about, I'm going to meet this standard by doing a presentation to the class, or I'm going to meet this standard in some other way. So we give students options in terms of how they can demonstrate and meet that standard, as long as sometime during their high school career, we're being sure that they've kind of used a lot of different approaches for learning. So we don't want students who are shy, for example, to never in their 5-year high school experience to ever do public presentations. We might say you don't have to do this for the first 2 years, but we will say you need to do this before you graduate. So that on the academic side is the personalization. On the affective or youth development side, every student has their own plan. And the plan is both about what they see themselves doing in career, who they see themselves as now, what some of the strategies are that they might want to use with their counselor and during PAC time to get stronger and overcome problems, as well as what some of their long-term college goals might be. So in both youth development and academically, I would say that there are choices every day and every week that we're asking students to make.
Great. And then on the element of pacing, how do you make sure that kids are, what does on pace mean? Or how do you make sure that kids are progressing in a way that's meaningful and not just hanging back there?
Yeah, again, a great question, and we have done the math, so to speak. So we have determined that the maximum that we can have students with us to succeed, given a bunch of issues, including aging out, is 5 years. So we basically have told ourselves that we have a calculus in mind where we're expecting that students are going to be able to move through the 4 levels in no more than 5 years. So whether that be, right now what we have is basically we have 102 students began, as I said, 100 were in Core 1, 2 started in Core 2. By November, we had moved 46 into Core 2, with the remainder, about 54, being still in Core 1. By next year, most, if not all, of the students who were in Core 2 are going to be in transitions, and we're basically telling the Core 1 students that they have to move it in order to get at least into Core 2 by next year, if not farther. So we do have these kind of calculus that we're using to be able to tell students, you need to move faster.
That's interesting. So the students are clearly, obviously, then partners in this. Thank you very much, Ephraim. That was very helpful. So before we I talk about the upcoming webinars, because we've got 5 minutes left, I just wanted to, these are my notes of some of the key themes that were coming out from this conversation. These are such different models. And in addition to the flexibility on time, we have the narrowing of the curriculum, narrow over broad, deeper is important. The issue of assessment literacy of students, that's the first time I've ever heard that in a conversation. We hear about assessment literacy for teachers, but I've never heard that for students, and it's a very interesting point. Making sure that you determine where students are, hopefully before early on in the year or the year before, so that you're actually teaching to the level that they're at. Important for kids to learn how to learn. Thinking about both the affective and academic elements of a student's educational experience in terms of both pacing and personalization, having individual plans. And I'm sure there's a lot of other things other people have pulled out. And if you hear any other key themes that you want other folks to pay attention to, please use the chat room right now to share kind of the big ahas you might have had. So I just want to thank all of our panelists, David, Andrew, and Ephraim. You all are doing amazing work, and thank you so much for taking the time and sharing. I know that as a country, we'll be learning more and more about pacing and personalization as we go forward, especially with being able to use blended learning. So we just got another question from Todd. Ephraim, maybe if you can see the chat room, maybe you might be able to answer it. But we are out of time, I'm afraid. So our upcoming webinar. So the next one is spanning the grades. It's the superintendent and the director of curriculum instruction from Gray, New Gloucester, and Maine are going to talk about their whole district reform, and they are going to talk about they rolled out from elementary to middle and then to high school. So they're going to talk about the different models. A lot of times questions come up about elementary school. And so we'll be able to cover that there, as well as the differences between the different age groups and then what the district had to do to make all this happen. We're very excited. We're, in fact, finishing up the final touches right now on reengineering information technology, designing considerations for competency education. And our panelists will be Liz Gloa, who has actually been on this webinar, and Susan Patrick. And then on March 21st, Laura Shabilla and myself, and we're not exactly sure who yet, will be talking about the learning edge, supporting student success in the competency-based learning. And environment. Somehow that word came up in a competency-based learning environment, and we will be returning to the issues of pacing and personalization there because they're so important to making sure that kids are always in their optimal zone of learning. So I want to thank everybody for coming. This will be archived. It will be on the wiki. There are some resources on Schools for the Future on the wiki as well. Thank you, and everybody have a lovely afternoon.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.